Hello, U.S. history class. It's me, Mr. Denny, here with a exciting history lesson for you on the Democratic National Convention riot of 1968, as well as the election of 1968. Hopefully you're doing all right. Hopefully you're washing your hands, staying corona-free. We got notes here on my haiku page. I printed mine out just because it's easier to look at, but there's also the Google Docs version, or you can just handwrite them on paper. Just make sure that your notes basically answer these questions. You'll probably be good. So we're talking the riot, we're talking the election. We're going to be looking at these three somewhat handsome gentlemen. And our goal here is to be able to explain the impact of the 1968 DNC riot as well as the election. There's a little spoiler of how it's going to end up. Kind of one-sided a little bit. So what are the main issues? What's the major event happening in 1968 as we enter this election? Well, it's the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is still happening. It's still kind of losing support from the American people. The Civil Rights Movement is also in full swing, and we're going to spend all of April talking about the Civil Rights Movement. But just know that people are expecting and demanding a lot from their government, and the government really isn't delivering that at this point. People are also protesting the Vietnam War. Remember, we talked about the Kent State protests. We talked about the different art movements against the Vietnam War. So we're seeing a lot of controversy, a lot of conflict tied to the Vietnam War, tied to this, tied to the violence of it. Now, the next president, whoever it's going to be, needs to be able to address those issues. Well, the current president is Lyndon Johnson. He took over for JFK. He had his own election, and now Lyndon Johnson is deciding that he's not going to run. He's not going to seek re-election. Why is that? Well, one, the Vietnam War is highly unpopular, specifically because of the Tet Offensive. Even though the Americans kind of did okay, still that is seen as a huge blow against the Americans. And so the unpopularity of the Vietnam War is one major reason he doesn't seek re-election. Another reason is that Lyndon B. Johnson, he's also having some health issues, and he was looking for a way to kind of step down from this position. He wasn't sure if he'd be able to make it another term, but it's primarily the Vietnam War. He's becoming unpopular. And the Democratic Party as well, this is Lyndon Johnson's party, the Democratic Party is kind of beginning to get all splintered, beginning to get kind of fractioned off. Who is taking over? Well, it's Eugene McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy. Eugene McCarthy, by the way, different McCarthy than Joe McCarthy of McCarthyism, different guy. This is Eugene McCarthy, and he, along with Robert Kennedy, are both against the Vietnam War. They want to end the Vietnam War. They have strong support from people who are more liberal, more to the left of the political spectrum, and they are seen as kind of the natural people to step in as the candidate in this 1968 election. Well, two major things happen. Two major figures are lost. The first, Martin Luther King Jr. He is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, by James Earl Ray. And he is, one of, if not the most, prominent civil rights leaders. And so his loss is seen as a loss for the civil rights movement. And then we also lose Robert F. Kennedy, who was another really vocal supporter of the civil rights movement. Robert F. Kennedy is assassinated by Sirhan. And so that begins to shake up not only politics, but also society, right? We're looking for a new leader, a new figure when it comes to the civil rights movement. Who steps in? Who is chosen to kind of lead with all these gaps? It's a guy named Hubert Humphrey. What a exciting name. Hubert Humphrey, he was the vice president to Lyndon B. Johnson. And so Lyndon B. Johnson is like, Hubert Humphrey, you seem all right. And Hubert Humphrey's like, yes, I am. And Hubert Humphrey is essentially seen as Lyndon B. Johnson's stand-in. Like, hey guys, did you like the first movie called Lyndon B. Johnson? You'll love the sequel called Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey planned to continue the war in Vietnam. He was essentially just going to continue all of Lyndon B. Johnson's policies. So naturally, things are rocky, things are pretty shaky, and Democratic groups, labor unions, they're like, yeah, this guy, he seems like a stabilizing force. He's something familiar. We all know, we know what he was gonna do. We know what he's about. People who are against Hubert Humphrey, though, are those young anti-war protesters, people who supported Robert F. Kennedy, people who supported Eugene McCarthy. They're like, no, we don't want more of the same. This is what we've been protesting against this whole time. Regardless, the Democratic Party, essentially, they just push Hubert Humphrey. They're like, Humphrey is the way to go. This is the direction of the party. I got these fun little buttons. Humphrey's running mate, by the way, last name Muskie, so Humphrey Muskie. Really great name there. And then Robert F. Kennedy, R.I.P. So let's go to the National Convention then. So Humphrey isn't the candidate yet. Before they actually decide this is the Democratic candidate, this is the Republican candidate, they hold what's called a National Convention. And basically all the representatives from all the states for that party, they show up to one place and they formally nominate, they formally vote to have this person be the candidate. And it was kind of assumed that Humphrey was going to be the candidate. So naturally, 15,000 protesters show up, specifically protesting the Vietnam War, but also protesting this whole political thing that's been going on. So one of the major groups that shows up here would be the Youth International Party, or the Yippies. It's a fun name, Yippies. They announced that they were going to be coming to Chicago. They were like, we are going to shake things up. We are really going to let our message be heard. They also kind of made threats that they were going to throw nails off of overpasses to block roads, that they were going to be blocking intersections, that potentially they were going to be dumping drugs into the city's water supply. No, they didn't actually do any of those things. But their whole mission was to put across the message that average Americans are not in control over politics, that your average American isn't going to have a voice, that they aren't going to have a say when it comes to fighting in Vietnam. And so why not embrace that? Why not just disrupt society and shake things up, right? So the Youth International Party, they're like the Joker from Batman, right? They're like, let's just cause chaos because politics are a joke. Regardless, we're still going to come and, protest. So those are the Yippies. And then on the more kind of responsible end, we have a letter that you read in your Do Now, the Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. So this group is another major group that shows up to protest the Democratic National Convention, and they recognized and supported all tactics from marching to civil disobedience. They are a little bit more intentional. They know what their goal is when it comes to this protest. They want to use normal, kind of non-violent means to get their message across, to end the Vietnam War. And so they planned on having workshops. They planned on specifically going to black neighborhoods to hold these workshops to kind of politically empower these people. And so they can definitely be separated from the Yippies because they have a goal here and they know how to get to it, right? They're actually trying to create some change versus the Yippies who kind of just want to spread awareness versus the Yippies. Can I go back? Yeah. The Yippies who just they want to let everyone know hey, politics is kind of a joke, right? So we've got Yippies, we've got Moby. It's a fun one, Moby. So these two groups, they're coming to Chicago. They're coming to the convention to protest, and it's known. The mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, whose son, by the way, is eventually going to go on to work for Barack Obama. Richard Daley is like, okay, cool. I recognize that you guys are coming, but law and order will be maintained. I don't care what you're about, but like you are not going to disrupt my city. How does he prepare? Well, he doubles the police force. He switches them from 8-hour shifts to 12-hour shifts. So like you basically have twice the cops out on the streets. Cops also, they did have guns and like clubs, but then he also armed them with mace and riot helmets. So the police force is ready for these protesters. The protesters also, they applied for permits to stage this protest over the week, and the city denies them, basically because they were like, no, you're going to disrupt the city. Like you literally just announced that's what your goal was. And also the city believed that if they had these predominantly white protesters, if they come to Chicago and if they come to these black neighborhoods, then Chicago is going to send the police force to watch these protest groups. If these protest groups are in predominantly black neighborhoods, well, that's a riot, right? We've got white protesters, we've got cops in predominantly black neighborhoods. Chicago's like, nope, that's going to start a riot. Therefore, no, your permits are denied. So these groups are coming to Chicago without permits. And a few days before, or I guess one day before rather, the protesters are set to get there. A 17-year-old kid named Dean Johnson, he's African American. He stopped on the sidewalk. He's walking with his friend, but he stopped for a curfew violation. Johnson reportedly drew a gun and tried to shoot at the cops, but the gun misfired, and the cops returned fire, killing this kid, shooting him 3 times. Right. So this has happened the day before the protests are about to start, the day before the Democratic National Convention. So already, like, things are tense, right? Martin Luther King Jr. Is assassinated. Robert Kennedy is assassinated. The Democratic Party has just like chosen Hubert Humphrey over the people who are actually popular with the young progressive youth. And then Dean Johnson killed by police officers, right? So you've got all these things. Already things are tense. Well, protests are relatively peaceful Friday and Saturday. Tensions begin to rise on Sunday of the event. There's some confusion over the shutdown of a music festival. Like the crowd is like, oh, are the cops shutting it down? And the organizers are like, no, but the messages get crossed, right? Wires get crossed, and confusion starts. And we begin to see basically a police riot. So I've got 2 videos here. You can either pause it and then go check out those videos, either one. I'm going to show the short one here. The long one, I think, is more interesting, but I know some people, you don't want to sit there and watch a 6-minute video. But let's take a look at this 2-minute video. I think I can play it. Oh, there's my image that I used. So let's take a look. Again, you should probably pause it and watch this video on your own, but if you're just supremely lazy, we'll just watch it here. Let's hit play. So you can hear them yelling, the whole world is watching.
Hippies, they called themselves, converged on Chicago. They said they were there to protest the war, poverty, racism, and other social ills. Some of them were also determined to provoke a confrontation, to draw attention from the convention to the streets. Mayor Richard Daley vowed to keep it peaceful, even if it took force to keep the peace. He was backed by 12,000 police, 5,000 National Guardsmen, 7,500 regular Army troops.
Oh boy. So if you watch the 6-minute video, there's like way more of this kind of footage. Broadcast live, right? We saw how people reacted to the Vietnam War. Now they're seeing this, right? This is police
and dozens of policemen were injured.
violence.
Restraint was absent on both sides. This was later called a police riot. During that frightful week, The demonstrators repeatedly tried to march on the site of the convention, the stockyards. Repeatedly, they were forced back. But even inside the convention hall, the virus of violence was pervasive. Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite of CBS News.
Take your hands off of me. Unless you intend to arrest me, don't push me, please.
So let me just pause it right there. So, like, inside the convention center, the security guards, they knew what was going on outside. Like, they knew, like, what the police were doing. And so they also were like, oh no, are these people in the convention center, are they gonna start rioting too? And so the security kind of became, like, way more strict than they needed to be. And they started pushing around even these political representatives. And so you can see there, I'll just run it back just a little bit. That's what's going on, is there's a security guard who's like pushing these political representatives around, and this guy's like, what are you doing? This is insane. I'll run it back. Here we go.
It's pervasive. Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite of CBS News.
Take your hands off of me. Unless you intend to arrest me, don't push me, please.
Man, so we got some good primary source footage there, huh? That's pretty good. And they were chanting there. The protesters are chanting, "The whole world is watching," right? The whole world can see what you're doing. This is on live television. You better play it safe, right? So that's ultimately how the Democratic National Convention, that's how that goes. Hubert Humphrey is chosen. That's how the Democrats operate. What happens on the Republican side? Do we have anything? Not really. In comparison, it's pretty straightforward. Richard Nixon, he's a former vice president. He's run for president before. He ran 8 years ago, and he lost to JFK. But Nixon runs again. He wins the presidential nomination. He chooses a guy named Spiro Agnew as his vice president, as his running mate. If you've ever watched Futurama, you have seen Richard Nixon and also the body of Spiro Agnew. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, that's okay. I'm not going to test you over Futurama. But who are the other candidates? Because we've got what? We've got Humphrey, we've got Nixon. We've also got this guy named George Wallace from Alabama. He is a segregationist. He wants to... He's basically like, take the Republican stance, but he's also like, we should have segregation. Like, we should not be mixing the races in the South, right? So, naturally, he's going to be popular in the South. We've also got this guy named Curtis LeMay, who he not only wants to continue the Vietnam War, but he's like, we can continue it by dropping nuclear weapons, and then we'll end it. I don't know why I gave him a New York accent. He's from Ohio. But, like, these are the other candidates that we have out there. There's George Wallace. He's like, segregation. So we've got three major candidates here. Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, George Wallace. Nixon, he's campaigning for law and order. He said he has a secret plan to end the war. Nixon's running on a campaign to restore law and order. He sees what the youth are doing. He sees this riot, and he's like, we got to put a stop to this. Elect me. Wallace is critical of the Supreme Court. He's critical of LBJ's Great Society programs. And as we said, he wants to reinstitute segregation into the South and also the United States, right? Like, that's wild, right? It's just wild in 1968 that someone would have this viewpoint. By the way, I think I maybe missed who was found to be responsible for those riots. The police. It's a police riot. That's who is found responsible. And then the third candidate, Hubert Humphrey, he supported most of Johnson's plans, right? Like, he's LBJ 2.0. Late in the campaign, he's like, okay, we'll stop fighting in Vietnam. But by that point, people were like, no, we know what you're about. You're just Lyndon B. Johnson, who the youth don't really care for. And so, like, last minute, he's like, oh, we'll end it. And he's like, no. We're not going to do it. So how does the election turn out? Well, here's a map. In the red, we have Nixon's states, the Republican Richard Nixon, the ones he won. You can see he won a lot more states. If we look at the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, kind of some scattered electoral votes. When it comes to the popular vote, if it's him between Nixon, it's just by, like, look at that. it's like less than 1%, right? Humphrey has, can I use my mouse? Oh, neat. Humphrey has 42.6. Nixon has 43.2, right? Super close. Who is this third candidate who kind of like takes a bunch of votes and kind of like disrupts it? It's George Wallace, right? Having this third candidate, George Wallace, essentially kind of cost the election for Humphrey, right? And so that leaves it wide open for Nixon to claim these states. Meanwhile, Humphrey and Wallace are kind of splitting up these votes. So the result there is Nixon wins 300 electoral votes, even though, Hubert Humphrey won a bunch of the popular vote. It's electoral votes that count, right? This is the Electoral College. Nixon wins. The counterculture movement, though, the youth movement, what happens there? So Nixon receives, technically, just a little bit more of the popular vote. In the DNC riot, though, these riots are widely reported as a police riot, right? It's acknowledged by the journalists, it's acknowledged by those in charge. Who started the riot? Who's responsible? It's the police. However, this on television worries the middle-aged folks, right? They see this on TV and they're like, oh boy, the youth are out of control. Nixon's the guy who's going to kind of like tighten things up. Nixon's the guy who's going to be our law and order, restore peace to the nation candidate. And Nixon continues that hardline stance against hippies, against counterculture, against, people going wild, the youth. He's seen as a guy who's like, oh, we're going to bring law and order back to society. And then there's the little spoiler map from the beginning. All right. So hopefully you got your notes filled out. Hopefully you got everything. If you didn't, just run it back. You'll get it all again. All right. Well, good talking to you. Continue the lessons. I wish you luck. Go wash your hands. That's what I'm going to go do right now. All right. Bye.